The rain drummed against the library windows as Elena traced her finger along the spine of the prince, her graduate thesis on Renaissance political philosophy requiring another late night among dusty volumes. She had been researching the intersection of power dynamics and human attraction when she stumbled upon a pattern that would fundamentally alter her understanding of both love and conquest. Across the reading room, she observed Marcus, a fellow doctoral student whose quiet authority seemed to draw people into his orbit without effort. Unlike the boisterous attempts at dominance she witnessed in other men, Marcus possessed something different, an unshakable self-possession that made others, particularly women, gravitate toward him with an almost magnetic pull. As she watched him decline a social invitation with polite firmness, returning immediately to his work, Elena realized she was witnessing the very principles Machiavelli had outlined centuries ago, playing out in the modern arena of human relationships. The Florentine master had written extensively about power, but buried within his political treatises lay profound insights into the nature of attraction itself. The man who commanded genuine respect, Machiavelli observed, was not the one who desperately sought to control others, but rather the one who had achieved absolute mastery over himself. This self-mastery, this destruction of one's own weaknesses, created a gravitational field of influence that others found irresistible. Elena's research had led her to examine countless historical examples, but it was in the contemporary world that she found the most compelling evidence. The men who truly attracted women, not through manipulation or performative displays of power, but through genuine magnetism, all shared certain characteristics that aligned perfectly with Machiavellian principles of strength through self-discipline. Part 1. The Paradox of Attractive Power. The morning sun filtered through the corporate offices of Sterling and Associates, where David Chen conducted his business with the same methodical precision he applied to every aspect of his life. At 35, he had built a consulting empire not through aggressive tactics or political maneuvering, but through an almost supernatural ability to remain unmoved by the chaos that sent other men scrambling for relevance. Sarah, the firm's talented marketing director, found herself repeatedly drawn to David's office, ostensibly for business discussions, that somehow always extended beyond their scheduled duration. She couldn't articulate what made him different from other successful men she had known. Her ex-husband had been wealthy, her previous boyfriend had been charming, but neither had possessed what David emanated without apparent effort: complete comfort with himself and his place in the world. During a particularly stressful client crisis, Sarah watched David field angry phone calls, navigate conflicting demands from stakeholders, and manage a team of panicked consultants. Throughout the chaos, his voice remained level, his decisions clear and unwavering. When a junior associate broke down in tears over a perceived failure, David's response was neither harsh nor overly sympathetic, but precisely calibrated to restore both confidence and accountability. The mark of true strength, Machiavelli had written, is not the ability to crush one's enemies, but the wisdom to know when force is necessary and when restraint serves better. David embodied this principle not in matters of war and statecraft, but in the daily negotiations of modern professional life. His power came not from dominating others, but from his complete mastery of his own reactions and responses. This self-control created what Machiavelli identified as one of the most attractive qualities a person could possess: predictable unpredictability. David was consistent in his principles but adaptable in his methods. Women like Sarah found themselves drawn to this stability, this sense that here was a man who would not be swayed by emotional storms or external pressures, yet who remained capable of appropriate flexibility when circumstances demanded it. The psychological mechanism behind this attraction ran deeper than simple admiration for competence. Throughout human evolutionary history, women had developed keen instincts for identifying men who could provide security not just in terms of resources, but in terms of emotional and psychological stability. The man who had conquered his own weaknesses signaled his ability to handle the unpredictable challenges that life inevitably presented. In the downtown gym where David maintained his physical discipline, Elena observed another manifestation of this principle. Unlike the men who lifted weights to impress others or compensate for insecurities, David's approach to fitness reflected the same methodical self-improvement that characterized every other aspect of his life. He had identified physical weakness as a vulnerability and systematically eliminated it, not for external validation, but as part of his comprehensive approach to self-mastery. The women at the gym noticed him, of course. His physical presence commanded attention, but what kept their eyes following him was something more subtle: the complete absence of need for their attention. He trained with focused intensity, politely declined invitations that didn't align with his goals, and maintained friendly but clearly boundaried interactions with everyone he encountered. Most importantly, he had eliminated his desperate need for external validation. This inner security allowed him to interact with women from a position of genuine interest rather than need, creating the relaxed confidence that women found irresistibly attractive. During a company retreat in the mountains, Sarah found herself walking beside David on a hiking trail while other colleagues struggled to keep up with his steady pace. The physical metaphor was not lost on her. Here was a man who had conditioned himself to handle challenges that left others exhausted and struggling. Their conversation ranged from business strategy to philosophy, with David sharing insights that revealed both depth of thought and breadth of experience. When Sarah mentioned her own struggles with work-life balance, David's response was neither prescriptive nor dismissive, but genuinely curious about her specific situation and goals. "What does success look like for you?" he asked, the question revealing his ability to focus on her individual needs rather than projecting his own assumptions or offering generic advice. This quality of attention, focused but not needy, interested but not invasive, exemplified another Machiavellian principle adapted to interpersonal dynamics. The master strategist understood that true influence came from understanding others deeply while maintaining one's own independent judgment. Applied to attraction, this meant being genuinely interested in a woman's thoughts and feelings without losing one's own center or becoming emotionally dependent on her responses. As the hike continued, Sarah noticed how other members of their group sought David's guidance on everything from navigation to pace setting. His natural leadership emerged not from self-promotion or aggressive assertion, but from demonstrated competence and consistent reliability. When one colleague twisted an ankle, David's response was immediate and practical, assessing the injury, organizing assistance, and adjusting the group's plans without drama or self-congratulation. The incident revealed another crucial aspect of attractive masculinity. As understood through Machiavellian principles, the ability to handle crises with calm competence. Women throughout history had been drawn to men who remained functional under pressure, who could be counted on to take appropriate action when circumstances demanded it. This crisis management ability extended beyond physical challenges to emotional and social situations. David navigated interpersonal conflicts with the same steady competence he brought to professional challenges. When tensions arose between colleagues, he neither ignored the problem nor created additional drama through emotional reactions. Instead, he addressed issues directly but diplomatically, focusing on solutions rather than blame. The psychological appeal of this approach lay in its promise of security. A woman could trust that a man with such self-mastery would handle relationship challenges with the same steady competence he demonstrated in other areas of life. The man who had conquered his own emotional volatility was unlikely to create chaos in her life through unpredictable reactions or decisions. By evening, as the group gathered around a campfire, Sarah observed how David's presence seemed to anchor the entire social dynamic. He wasn't the loudest voice or the most attention-seeking personality, but conversation naturally oriented around his contributions. His comments were measured and thoughtful. His questions drew interesting responses from others, and his occasional humor was perfectly timed to enhance rather than dominate the mood. The phenomenon illustrated Machiavelli's observation that true power was often most effective when exercised subtly. The man who commanded attention through quiet authority was demonstrating a more sophisticated form of strength than the one who demanded attention through loud assertion. Women's attraction to this subtle dominance reflected their instinctive recognition of genuine versus manufactured confidence. As the fire died down and the group prepared to retire, David's goodnight to Sarah was warm but not lingering, friendly but not suggestive. His behavior maintained what Machiavelli might have called respectful distance, close enough to demonstrate interest, far enough to maintain mystery and preserve autonomy. This calibrated approach to interpersonal boundaries reflected another aspect of self-mastery, the ability to resist the temptation for immediate gratification in service of longer-term goals. The man who had destroyed his need for instant validation could afford to let attraction develop naturally rather than forcing premature intimacy through pushy behavior. Part 2. The Architecture of Self-Mastery. The conference room at Elena's university buzzed with intellectual energy as she presented her research findings to a gathering of psychology and philosophy professors. Her thesis had evolved beyond academic exercise into a comprehensive analysis of how Machiavellian principles of power translated into the modern dynamics of attraction and relationships. Dr. Peterson, the department head, challenged her conclusions. "You're suggesting that women are primarily attracted to power, but that seems to reduce complex emotional connections to simple dominance hierarchies." Elena's response revealed the sophistication of her analysis, not power over others, but power over oneself. The distinction is crucial. Women aren't drawn to tyranny or aggression. They're drawn to the security that comes from being with someone who has achieved genuine self-mastery. Her research had identified 3 core components of attractive masculine self-discipline, each reflecting principles that Machiavelli had outlined in political contexts but which applied with remarkable precision to personal development and romantic attraction. The first component was emotional regulation, the systematic elimination of reactive, impulsive behaviors that characterized weaker men. Through her observations and interviews, Elena had documented how women consistently lost attraction to men who displayed emotional volatility, neediness, or inability to handle stress without creating additional drama. Michael, one of her interview subjects, had learned this lesson through painful experience. A successful architect in his early 30s, he had consistently sabotaged promising relationships through what he now recognized as emotional incontinence, the inability to process feelings internally before expressing them externally. "I thought being emotionally open meant sharing every feeling as it arose," Michael explained during their interview. "If I felt insecure about something she did, I'd immediately bring it up for discussion. If I felt excited about our future, I'd start making plans out loud. I believed that emotional transparency was the foundation of intimacy." His pattern of relationships followed a predictable arc: initial mutual attraction, followed by increasing female withdrawal as his emotional neediness became apparent. The women he dated consistently described him as too intense or moving too fast, criticisms that initially confused him given his genuine care for their well-being. The transformation occurred when Michael began studying Stoic philosophy and applying its principles to his emotional life. Like Machiavelli, the Stoics understood that external circumstances were largely beyond individual control, but that one's response to those circumstances was entirely within the realm of personal mastery. Michael developed what he called emotional processing protocols, structured approaches to handling feelings before they became external behaviors. When insecurity arose, instead of immediately seeking reassurance from his girlfriend, he would examine the source of the feeling, determine whether it reflected legitimate concerns or personal insecurities, and decide on appropriate action only after achieving emotional clarity. This internal processing created what women experienced as emotional reliability. Instead of being subjected to his unfiltered emotional states, they experienced him as someone who dealt with his feelings maturely and only shared them when doing so served a constructive purpose. The change in romantic outcomes was dramatic. Women who had previously pulled away from his intensity now found themselves drawn deeper into relationship with him. His newfound emotional stability created space for their own feelings to emerge naturally, without the pressure of having to manage his emotional needs in addition to their own. The second component Elena identified was purpose-driven living, the organization of one's life around meaningful goals that transcended immediate gratification or the pursuit of female approval. Machiavelli had written extensively about the importance of having clear objectives that guided decision-making, and this principle proved equally applicable to personal development. Thomas, another subject in Elena's study, exemplified this transformation from aimless drifting to purposeful action. At 28, despite having a good job in marketing, he found himself unable to maintain women's interest beyond initial physical attraction. His lifestyle consisted primarily of work, socializing at bars, playing video games, and pursuing women, activities that generated no particular respect or admiration. The shift occurred when Thomas discovered rock climbing. What began as a casual weekend activity evolved into a passionate pursuit that required systematic skill development, physical conditioning, and significant time commitment. The change in his social dynamics was immediate and profound. "Suddenly I had something to talk about besides work and weekend plans," Thomas explained. "But more than that, I had something that required discipline and progression. Women could see that I was someone who set goals and achieved them, who could delay gratification for meaningful accomplishments." The climbing gym became a natural social environment where Thomas's developed skills and quiet confidence attracted attention without effort on his part. Women who observed him navigating difficult routes saw evidence of problem-solving ability, physical competence, and mental toughness, qualities that translated into attraction more effectively than any amount of deliberate charm or conversation skills. The pursuit also restructured his schedule in ways that increased his natural scarcity. Weekend climbing trips meant he was less available for casual social plans. Training during the week meant he couldn't always accommodate last-minute invitations. His growing skill level created opportunities to travel and connect with communities of like-minded individuals. Most importantly, the pursuit gave him a context for self-improvement that wasn't dependent on female approval. His progress was measurable through objective standards, routes completed, strength gains, technical skills acquired, rather than through subjective validation from others. This independence from external approval created the inner security that women found magnetically attractive. The third component was intellectual depth, the cultivation of knowledge and understanding that extended beyond immediate practical needs. Machiavelli himself embodied this principle, combining political acumen with literary skill, historical knowledge, and philosophical insight. In modern contexts, Alina observed that women were consistently drawn to men who demonstrated intellectual curiosity and the ability to engage with ideas at sophisticated levels. Alexander, a software engineer who had initially struggled with dating despite considerable professional success, transformed his romantic prospects through systematic intellectual development. Recognizing that his expertise in coding, while valuable professionally, didn't generate broader social interest, he began deliberately expanding his knowledge base. He started with history, reading extensively about different civilizations and historical periods. This foundation led him to philosophy, literature, and eventually to art and music appreciation. The learning wasn't academic. He sought understanding that he could apply to contemporary life and share in conversation. The impact on his dating life was subtle but profound. Women found themselves engaged in conversations that went beyond surface-level topics. His ability to draw connections between historical patterns and current events, to reference literature in ways that illuminated personal experiences, and to discuss ideas with genuine enthusiasm rather than pretentious display, created intellectual attraction that deepened emotional and physical chemistry. During one dinner date, Alexander's girlfriend later told Elena the conversation had ranged from the restaurant's Italian cuisine to the history of trade routes that brought those ingredients to Europe, to the cultural exchanges that shaped Mediterranean cooking, to broader patterns of how cultures influenced each other throughout history. The discussion wasn't lecture-like or overwhelming, but naturally flowing and mutually engaging. "I realized I was with someone who saw connections everywhere," she explained. "His mind worked differently than other men I had dated. There was depth there that made me want to explore more." This intellectual attraction complemented rather than replaced physical and emotional chemistry. Women reported that men with genuine intellectual depth became more physically attractive over time, as mental stimulation enhanced overall appeal. The combination created relationships that remained interesting as physical novelty inevitably decreased. Elena's research revealed that these three components, emotional regulation, purposeful living, and intellectual depth, worked synergistically to create what she termed integrated masculinity. Each component reinforced the others. Emotional stability supported consistent pursuit of meaningful goals. Purposeful activity created context for intellectual growth, and intellectual development provided frameworks for better emotional understanding. The integration reflected Machiavelli's understanding that true power required multiple dimensions of competence. The political leader who relied solely on force was vulnerable to circumstances that required diplomacy. The one who depended only on popularity was vulnerable to shifts in public opinion. Similarly, masculine attractiveness that depended on only one dimension, looks, money, charm, or status, proved fragile when circumstances changed or when women's priorities evolved. Men who achieved integration across multiple dimensions created what Elena called anti-fragile attractiveness, appeal that increased rather than decreased under stress or challenge. When financial circumstances changed, they had emotional stability and intellectual resources to navigate difficulties. When physical appearance aged, they had depth of character and purposeful activity to maintain interest. When initial romantic excitement faded, they had ongoing intellectual and personal growth to sustain long-term connection. The concept directly paralleled Machiavelli's famous observation that the prince who could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles would prove most successful over time. In romantic contexts, the man who could evolve and grow while maintaining his essential character proved most attractive to women seeking long-term partnership. During a faculty dinner party, Elena observed these principles playing out in real-time social dynamics. Professor Martinez, a respected historian in his 40s, exemplified integrated masculinity in his interactions with both male colleagues and their wives. His conversation was substantive but not dominating. His attention to others was genuine but not needy, and his presence was commanding but not overwhelming. When the discussion turned to contemporary political challenges, Martinez's contribution was informed by historical perspective but grounded in current realities. When personal topics arose, his responses showed emotional intelligence without crossing boundaries into inappropriate intimacy. When practical problems were discussed, from home repairs to investment strategies, he offered useful insights without claiming expertise beyond his knowledge. The women present, Elena noted, consistently oriented toward Martinez in subtle but observable ways. They made more eye contact during his contributions, asked follow-up questions about his comments, and sought his opinions on topics under discussion. Their husbands, rather than appearing threatened, seemed to respect his natural authority and often deferred to his judgment on matters where his expertise was relevant. The social dynamic illustrated how integrated masculinity created win-win rather than zero-sum interactions. Martinez's presence enhanced rather than diminished other men's social standing, while creating genuine attraction from women that was based on respect and admiration rather than competition or scarcity. After the dinner, Elena reflected on how this model differed fundamentally from more aggressive or manipulative approaches to attraction. The pickup artist strategies that had gained popularity in certain circles relied on psychological manipulation, artificial scarcity, and exploitation of female insecurities. While such approaches might generate short-term interest, they ultimately proved unsustainable because they were based on deception rather than genuine value. The Machiavellian approach Elena had identified was fundamentally different. It focused on actually becoming the kind of man who naturally attracted respect and desire, rather than on creating illusions of such qualities. The self-mastery was real, not performed. The value was substantive, not manufactured. The confidence was earned, not assumed. This authenticity proved crucial to long-term success in relationships. Women's highly developed abilities to detect incongruence between claimed and actual qualities meant that any approach based on deception would eventually be discovered and rejected. The man who had actually achieved self-mastery could withstand the scrutiny that deepening relationships inevitably brought. Moreover, the integration of emotional, purposeful, and intellectual development created a self-reinforcing cycle of growth. Success in one area generated confidence and skills that supported development in other areas. The man who learned emotional regulation became better at pursuing long-term goals. The man who achieved meaningful accomplishment developed intellectual frameworks for understanding his success. The man who cultivated intellectual depth gained tools for better emotional management. This upward spiral reflected another Machiavellian principle, that power properly exercised generated more power rather than depleting it. The man who had conquered his weaknesses found that each victory made subsequent challenges more manageable, creating momentum toward ever greater self-mastery and, consequently, ever greater self-attractiveness to high-quality women. Part 3. The Invulnerable Man and the Nature of True Attraction. The corporate retreat had evolved into something more profound than anyone anticipated. As senior executives from Fortune 500 companies gathered in the Colorado mountains for what was supposed to be a standard leadership development program, the conversation had shifted toward more fundamental questions about power, influence, and human relationships. Daniel Richmond, the program facilitator and former military officer turned executive coach, had watched with interest as the group dynamics revealed the principles Elena's research had identified. Among the 30 participants, certain men naturally assumed informal leadership roles, while others, despite impressive credentials and corporate positions, seemed to diminish in the group setting. The pattern was most evident during unstructured time. While some executives sought to dominate conversations through volume and assertion, the men who actually commanded attention did so through what Machiavelli would have recognized as natural authority, the kind that emerged from inner security rather than external positioning. Robert Chen, CEO of a mid-sized technology firm, exemplified this principle. During heated discussions about market strategy, he rarely spoke first or longest, but his contributions consistently shifted the conversation toward more productive directions. His questions revealed deeper thinking than most participants' statements, and his observations often synthesized complex issues into clearer frameworks for decision-making. What made Robert particularly interesting from Elena's theoretical perspective was his complete indifference to the group's approval or disapproval of his contributions. He shared insights when he believed they would be useful, remained silent when he had nothing valuable to add, and showed no emotional reaction to others' agreement or disagreement with his positions. This emotional independence created what other participants experienced as unshakable confidence. Robert couldn't be manipulated through flattery or intimidated through criticism because his self-worth wasn't dependent on external validation. The security this created in others was palpable. They knew that his responses to them were genuine rather than strategic, making him a safe person to engage with authentically. The retreat's most revealing moment came during a crisis simulation exercise designed to test leadership under pressure. Teams were presented with a complex business scenario involving multiple stakeholders, competing priorities, and time constraints that made careful analysis impossible. Most participants defaulted to familiar patterns. Aggressive personalities tried to force quick decisions. Analytical types became paralyzed by insufficient information. And political operators focused more on positioning themselves favorably than on solving the actual problem. Robert's approach was different. He quickly assessed the situation, identified the core issues that needed resolution, and organized the team around specific responsibilities that matched individual strengths. When team members became emotional or defensive, he neither dismissed their feelings nor allowed their reactions to derail progress. Instead, he acknowledged their concerns while maintaining focus on the objectives. "I understand your frustration with the time constraints," he told one agitated participant, "but we need to make decisions with the information we have. What's your best recommendation given what we know right now?" His ability to remain functional under pressure while helping others do the same created the kind of leadership that teams naturally followed. There was no coercion involved, no manipulation of group dynamics, simply the magnetic pull that competence under pressure always generated. The exercise revealed what Elena had identified as the ultimate expression of Machiavellian self-mastery. The man who had eliminated his own weaknesses became essentially invulnerable to external manipulation or destruction. He couldn't be intimidated because he had conquered his own fears. He couldn't be corrupted because he had clear principles that transcended immediate gratification. He couldn't be manipulated because his self-worth didn't depend on others' opinions. This invulnerability proved intensely attractive to the women who observed it, whether in professional or personal contexts. Sandra Williams, one of the few female executives at the retreat, found herself drawn into conversation with Robert during breaks, not from romantic interest, but from genuine respect for his character and judgment. "There's something different about how you handle conflict," she observed during one discussion. "Most men either get aggressive or withdrawn when challenged. But you seem to stay completely centered. How did you develop that?" Robert's answer revealed the depth of work that had gone into his character development. "I spent years identifying all the things that could throw me off balance. Criticism, rejection, failure, uncertainty, and systematically exposed myself to those experiences in controlled ways until they no longer had power over me." His explanation illustrated a crucial aspect of self-mastery that Elena's research had identified. It required deliberate practice rather than natural talent. The men who achieved genuine invulnerability did so through systematic exposure to their fears and weaknesses, gradually building immunity through controlled challenges. Robert had practiced public speaking until criticism of his presentations no longer affected his emotional state. He had started businesses knowing they might fail, removing the paralyzing fear of failure that kept other men trapped in safe but unfulfilling careers. He had approached attractive women, knowing he might be rejected, eliminating the neediness that made such rejections devastating to his self-worth. Each conquered fear had strengthened his overall resilience while removing another potential avenue for external manipulation. The man who wasn't afraid of failure couldn't be controlled through threats to his security. The man who wasn't devastated by rejection couldn't be manipulated through withholding of approval. The man who wasn't attached to others' opinions couldn't be swayed by social pressure. This systematic approach to character development reflected Machiavelli's understanding that security came not from avoiding challenges but from building the capacity to handle whatever challenges might arise. The prince who prepared for various contingencies was less vulnerable than the one who hoped circumstances would remain favorable. Applied to personal development, this meant that attractive masculinity wasn't about being naturally gifted or lucky, but about systematically identifying and eliminating personal vulnerabilities. The process was methodical rather than accidental, strategic rather than hopeful. Thomas Morrison, a venture capitalist in his late 30s, had undergone his own version of this transformation after a painful divorce that had revealed multiple areas of personal weakness. The end of his marriage had forced him to confront his emotional dependence, his lack of clear personal direction, and his tendency to define himself through external achievements rather than internal character. The recovery process became a comprehensive program of self-development that addressed every aspect of his life. He began therapy to understand and heal the emotional patterns that had contributed to his marriage's failure. He started a rigorous physical fitness program to eliminate the self-consciousness that came from poor health. He read extensively in philosophy and psychology to develop frameworks for understanding himself and relationships. Most importantly, he began saying no to commitments that didn't align with his values or goals, even when such refusals came at significant social or professional cost. This boundary setting was initially uncomfortable, but it gradually created space for activities and relationships that genuinely mattered to him. The transformation was evident to everyone who knew him. Colleagues noticed his increased confidence and decisiveness in business situations. Friends observed his emotional stability and clarity about his priorities. Women he dated experienced him as someone who was genuinely interested in them as individuals rather than as sources of validation or solutions to his loneliness. 6 months after completing his self-development program, Thomas met Sarah at a professional networking event. Their interaction exemplified the principles Elena had identified. He was genuinely interested in her thoughts about the industry trends being discussed, but his attention wasn't needy or overwhelming. He invited her to continue the conversation over coffee, but when she mentioned being busy with a major project, he responded with understanding rather than persistence. "Let me know when your schedule opens up," he said simply, then returned to the networking event without any sign of disappointment or wounded pride. The response demonstrated what had become Thomas's natural approach to all relationships: genuine interest combined with complete emotional independence. He wanted to get to know Sarah better, but his well-being didn't depend on her availability or reciprocation of his interest. This combination of warmth and independence proved magnetically attractive. Sarah found herself thinking about their brief conversation repeatedly over the following days, impressed not just by Thomas's intelligence and accomplished background, but by his complete lack of neediness or pressure. When she did contact him 2 weeks later, their coffee meeting extended into a long walk through the city, with conversation ranging from professional challenges to personal philosophies to shared interests in travel and literature. Thomas's ability to engage deeply on multiple levels, intellectual, emotional, and practical, while maintaining his own center and independence, created the kind of attraction that grew stronger rather than weaker with time. Their relationship development followed a pattern that Elena had observed in her most successful case studies: steady deepening of connection without the drama or instability that characterized relationships involving men who hadn't achieved self-mastery. Thomas's emotional regulation meant that minor conflicts were handled through direct communication rather than manipulation or withdrawal. His purposeful living meant that the relationship enhanced rather than replaced his personal goals and interests. His intellectual development meant that conversations remained engaging as initial romantic novelty evolved into deeper partnership. 2 years later, when Elena interviewed them as a couple for her research, both Thomas and Sarah identified his self-mastery as the foundation of their successful relationship. Sarah was particularly articulate about the difference between Thomas and previous boyfriends who had been successful but hadn't done the inner work of character development. "With other men, I always felt like I was either being pursued too aggressively or having to do emotional labor to manage their insecurities," she explained. "With Thomas, I could just be myself and focus on whether we were compatible, rather than trying to navigate his needs or reassure his ego." Thomas's perspective was equally illuminating. "The irony is that by becoming completely okay with being alone, I became much better at being with someone else. When you're not desperate for a relationship to fill some void in your life, you can actually evaluate whether a particular person enhances your life and whether you enhance theirs." This dynamic reflected the deepest level of Machiavellian wisdom as applied to relationships. True power came not from controlling others, but from controlling oneself so completely that external circumstances couldn't disturb one's fundamental well-being. The man who had achieved this level of self-mastery could engage with women from a position of genuine strength, rather than hidden weakness. Elena's research culminated in understanding that the attraction women felt toward such men wasn't superficial or manipulable, but represented a deep recognition of authentic strength. Throughout evolutionary history, women had developed sophisticated abilities to identify men who could provide not just immediate resources or protection, but long-term stability and support through unpredictable challenges. The man who had conquered his own weaknesses signaled his ability to handle whatever difficulties life might present. His emotional stability suggested he would remain functional during crises rather than creating additional problems through poor reactions. His purposeful living indicated he would continue growing and contributing rather than stagnating or becoming a burden. His intellectual development meant he could adapt to changing circumstances rather than being overwhelmed by complexity. Most fundamentally, His self-mastery communicated that he was choosing to be in a relationship from strength rather than need, making him a partner rather than a dependent. This voluntary commitment, freely given from a position of capability and independence, represented the kind of love that women most desired, not the desperate clinging of weakness, but the generous sharing of strength. The final insight Elena reached was that this dynamic created relationships that strengthened rather than weakened both parties. When a man had eliminated his own weaknesses and needs, he could focus on understanding and supporting his partner's growth rather than trying to extract validation or security from her. When a woman was with a man she could rely on rather than manage, she could focus on her own development and contributions rather than on maintaining his emotional stability. The result was partnership in the truest sense. Two capable individuals choosing to combine their strengths rather than using each other to compensate for personal weaknesses. Such relationships proved resilient through challenges that destroyed partnerships based on mutual dependency or complementary inadequacies. As Elena completed her research and prepared her final thesis presentation, she reflected on how Machiavelli's insights into power and human nature had proved remarkably applicable to the most personal aspects of modern life. The Renaissance master's understanding that true strength came from self-discipline rather than external domination had created a framework for masculine development that generated both personal fulfillment and genuine attractiveness to high-quality women. The men who followed these principles didn't manipulate or coerce female interest. They earned it through the patient work of character development. They didn't seek to control women's responses. They controlled their own responses so completely that they became naturally attractive. They didn't try to make themselves indispensable through creating dependency. They made themselves valuable through developing genuine worth. In the end, Elena realized Machiavelli's greatest insight was that the strongest position was also the most ethical one. The man who had conquered himself could afford to be generous, honest, and genuinely caring because he wasn't operating from desperation or insecurity. The power that came from self-mastery created possibilities for authentic love that weaker men, trapped in their neediness and fears, could never achieve. The library where Elena had begun her research now held her completed thesis. 8,000 words that bridged centuries of wisdom to illuminate timeless truths about strength, attraction, and human nature. As she walked past the table where she had first observed Marcus demonstrating these principles in action, she smiled at the recognition that some insights once discovered changed not just academic understanding but the very way one moved through the world. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. Elena stepped into the light, carrying with her the knowledge that true power, whether in Renaissance Italy or modern America, whether in politics or romance, ultimately came down to the same fundamental principle. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, and in that invulnerability lies attractiveness that no external force can diminish or defeat.